Joining me right now is the chairman of the Select Committee on China and a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Mike Gallagher. Mr. Chairman, great to see you. Thanks very much for being here this weekend.
Of course, great to be with you.
I want to talk about that meeting that you had this week with Wall Street executives. Do you believe that businesses understand the threat that is communist China?
Well, our job, our mission is to make them understand. And towards that end, not only did we conduct a field hearing, we conducted a war game in which we invited a lot of major asset managers and bankers to understand the implications of a scenario. This scenario took place in 2028, involving China trying to take Taiwan and the utter havoc it would wreak on the global financial system. And one of the biggest takeaways was that if we do not make hard choices now, we have very few good options in 2028. And you could see in the room how concerned people were about taking some options, aggressive options that I think would be necessary against China because of the financial and economic implications for America. All the more reason why we need to be having this discussion now. Given the increasing risks of investing in China, you would think that if American pension money were going into Chinese firms, we would have much higher accounting and regulatory standards for these firms, especially when they list on our exchanges. But as you know, Maria, as you've been covering long before anyone else, the very opposite is true. For example, a recent deal struck between the SEC, the PCAOB, and the Chinese government effectively circumvents U.S. law and allows China to audit its own firms, basically throwing American investors to the wolves. So this is why our committee exists, to have these tough conversations and ultimately force Wall Street and force Congress to act before it's too late.
So I wonder if, in fact, we do see communist China go in, invade Taiwan, try to acquire Taiwan, is the right move to deregister and delist those Chinese companies from U.S. exchanges?
If they did something as extreme as trying to invade Taiwan, to me, that move would be table stakes. We would be contemplating things far more aggressive than that. But here's the thing. If we don't start holding them accountable now, you're going to have a chorus of major Wall Street executives, major lobbyists trying to convince members of Congress or even the executive branch not to act. And, you know, the other thing we started to try to impress on our friends in New York is the starting parallels we're seeing. Wall Street pushing trillions of risky securities onto unwitting Americans, using financial engineering to skirt the rules and lobbying to fight all regulation. But instead of subprime mortgages in 2008, this time it's Chinese securities that often use obscure things like VIE structures to strip shareholder rights and corporate governance from investors. So again, that's why we need to have this conversation now. We need to stop funding our own destruction. At a minimum, we shouldn't be allowing major asset managers to invest in Chinese military companies that are building things designed to kill Americans in a future conflict.
Do they not factor into their business models national security risks?
That's one of the key takeaways from our field hearing. And one of our witnesses, former SEC Commissioner Jay Clayton, really teased out that businesses should be forced to disclose the risk entailed by their exposure and their presence in China. I don't think it's adequately being factored in right now. Also, what does it mean in terms of their fiduciary duty to investors when you're talking about investing in technology that could be used to perpetrate a genocide or egregious human rights abuses or expedite Xi Jinping's timeline for potentially provoking a war? We need more transparency. And here's the other thing, as we've talked about before, Maria, I used to think that, Wall Street wanted into China for the same reason Dillinger robbed banks, because that's where the money is. But it's not even clear to me that these are good investments. And that's what Jim Chanos's testimony really hammered home when compared against the S&P 500 over the last decade. A lot of these ETFs linked to China haven't really performed that well. So even if you're just calculating the cold, financial incentive, China seems like a bad investment right now.
That is such a great point. We question whether or not we're actually getting the real story when we see the economic data coming out of China. The economy there is actually, I think, a lot worse than they're letting on, isn't it?
It is. And here's what's really troubling to me. The President Biden, was in Vietnam, and he said something to the effect of, well, China's economy is slowing down, therefore the risk of a Taiwan war are less likely. I completely disagree. Or let me say it's equally plausible that Xi Jinping could get more aggressive as he faces more domestic economic and demographic headwinds. And for the president of the United States to go out there and say something like that, I think undermines the urgency we need in order to deter a war from happening in the first place. And here's where I agree with, big time Wall Street folks who are far more dovish on China than I am. I concede the fact that a war with China would be incredibly destructive, and it is something we should seek to prevent. But we need to deter it through strength and tough financial and economic action now, again, before it's too late.